Good evening and welcome to another edition of Global Perspectives. Tonight we're going to be talking about a topic that's on everyone's mind, not only here in Sri Lanka but all around the world. A topic that we are all worried about, angry about, and frustrated about, and that is oil prices. Crude oil prices have increased 15% already this year. On average, the current prices are even higher than in 2008, which was considered the worst year yet when it comes to oil prices. On tonight's show, we're going to take a closer look at how oil prices fluctuate, what factors come into play, and how they impact us as consumers. Our guest tonight is someone who has an up-close view at how all this works. We'll be talking with the Managing Director of Lanka IOC, Mr. Suresh Kumar. All that and more coming up on Global Perspectives tonight. When we hear that prices of petrol will be increasing, the immediate reaction of much of the general public is to blame the government. Take, for example, the United States. Some analysts are predicting that the increasing price of oil will be the biggest threat to President Obama's re-election. While national policies do play a role in oil prices, directing all our anger and frustration toward governments cannot be fully justified. In our first report, we take a look at how all this works and the other factors that come into play in determining oil prices.
As with any other product, the change in the price of oil is primarily due to the basic economic forces of supply and demand. Prices increase when the amount of crude oil in the world market is limited compared to the growing demand. As a result, we all feel that pinch in our wallets when we stop at the gas station.
Two things that are at work is that with low spare capacity in Saudi Arabia, there's an emphasis on a higher price. But we're getting to the point, which is really a tipping point on demand, and if the price gets much higher, we're going to see it as a tax on the consumer globally, and demand will almost certainly come down. So I'm sticking with the...
But when it comes to petroleum products, several other factors come into play as well. One of the factors is government regulation. Taxes on gasoline or special laws such as those to protect the environment or reduce the impact on climate change will also affect fuel prices. Another aspect that has a significant impact on is the way oil is traded on the financial markets or the investment in oil futures, which are essentially predictions and bets on how much oil will cost at a later date. This speculation of higher fuel prices can cause producers to hold back oil supplies to sell it later for a higher price. That reduces existing supplies and ends up raising both current and future prices. Other than these factors, any major world event that disrupts the oil production or supply process can have an impact on the prices. For example, wars in the Middle East have always influenced prices because production is disrupted. Hurricanes and other weather events in the Gulf of Mexico affect supplies in North America. What all this shows is that the production and supply of fossil fuels is such a complex process that it is nearly impossible to pinpoint one factor as the sole reason for price fluctuations. Reporting for Global Perspectives, I'm Mahina Bongzo from the News First International Desk.
Our guest tonight is Mr. Suresh Kumar, the Managing Director of Lanka IOC, a subsidiary of the Indian Oil Corporation. As someone who is on the front lines of dealing with the causes and the effects of fluctuating oil prices, Mr. Suresh Kumar talks to us about how a company such as his, that is tasked with bringing petroleum products to the consumer, deals with these various factors. Mr. Suresh Kumar, thank you very much for joining us on Global Perspectives and giving us your time. As you know, we're here to talk about how exactly these oil prices work, because we have been experiencing some basically ups in oil prices, although I did read it has slightly gone down again this week, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So I was wondering in this first segment if we could talk about some of the different factors that play into the increase or the decrease of oil prices around the world. So let's start off, because the first instinct of people is to blame the governments. In any country, basically, you just blame the government when the oil prices goes up. Can you explain what kind of a role do governments play in this whole process?
At the outset, thank you for calling me for the discussion. Actually, oil prices there are multiple factors in that. One is the various governments which play a role, which particularly those countries in the Middle East where the governments play a very, very active role in controlling the oil prices or determining the oil prices. The second segment is that where companies play a role, the larger companies, multinational companies play a role in the oil price. Both have very significant role to play in that. In many cases we find where large countries do have government-to-government contracts in finalizing the oil prices or even finalizing the terms of the supplies, whereas smaller countries do not have that kind of an opportunity. So it is necessary that we need to understand which government we are dealing with and which countries we are dealing with when deciding what kind of prices we can get or what kind of contracts we can get. The second is, are we in a market where our requirements vary from time to time? We deal with different parties or different countries, and oil prices can be different. So there is a need to understand what are the government contracts can be there and what kind of contract do we have, what prices we pay. So there is a significant role played by the various OPEC countries which are large producers of oil. See, they do determine that. Well, that is on the one side. Second side is the demand of countries like China and India, which is growing really well. So if in a particular period of time the demand is far higher than what supplies can be, then you will find that oil prices are higher. There are also many other factors which happen. If there is a problem in the Middle East or there is a problem elsewhere, temporarily there can be an increase in the oil prices. So every one of these factors has something to do. In that context, if you find that today the oil prices are high, what we find in a day's drop or a thing maybe to temporary market condition, but I don't think that's a very significant factor. It could again go up.
So are you basically saying for non-oil producing companies, are we basically at the mercy of those larger countries who do produce most of the oil around the world?
You could say that. Actually, we are at the mercy in the sense that we are net importers of oil. As long as you are an importer of oil, you are at the mercy of everybody who is producing oil, which is a fact. That's something which we can't do, we can't wish it away. So given that condition, it's necessary that what kind of contracts we can have with any government and what kind of products do we need. That will determine the best deal under the circumstances. But we are, in a sense, we are at the mercy. There is no escape from that. That's something it's a reality. We need to understand the reality.
Are you able to talk about, now you talk about individual countries having different contracts with these oil producing nations. Are you able to talk about, for example, your own country, India or Sri Lanka, how they operate with the oil producing companies?
Yeah, they do. In fact, every one of these countries, depending on their need and depending on the kind of equation they enjoy with the countries, they do go for government-to-government contracts, either for crude or for products. It happens. Also, you will find that in the domestic requirement, you have certain refineries which can use certain categories of oil or certain quality of crude oil. That will mean the source is fixed. Like in the case of Sri Lanka, we have a refinery which can process the Iranian crude a lot better than any other crude. So obviously you need to have some contract with an Iranian government or the company which will meet that requirement, which is a requirement there. Similarly, in India it happened that there were contracts with many countries like Kuwait and Iraq and so many, even Russia, where crude was being supplied. So this happens to many countries where, depending on your requirement of crude, the quality of the crude, you do have government-to-government contracts or long-term contracts to meet your requirement. It's a fact, it happens.
What about companies such as yourself? Can you talk about how you operate or the role that companies like yours plays in when oil prices fluctuate?
Actually, again, we are in Sri Lanka, we are an import of petroleum products. I do not deal in crude. Even that, assume that we only deal with petroleum products. When the global prices go up, it's something you can't escape. You need to understand that reality. I need to buy this product. Many efforts are made by many companies at various points of time. One, if I can't get products on a spot, can I go for a term contract where my basic prices cannot be fixed, my premiums can be fixed if I have a regular requirement of product. That happens. Second issue is that if I can source the product from such places where my cost of transportation can be cheaper or my cost of handling can be cheaper, that can we do that? We examine every factor while doing this activity. Also, our efforts have always been one is the price of crude, price of product which we get. Second, my own handling cost within Sri Lanka. How best I can reduce that? The product price you can't reduce, but you can improve your efficiency. How best you can improve that?
Can you give us some examples of how you try to do that?
See, basically, we say size our cargo size. Can we get 20,000 tons or can we get 30,000 tons? Will it be cheaper if I do that? Should I get more petrol now? Should I get more diesel now? What kind of premiums I pay on that? Should I get the product at Colombo or should I get the product in Komali? So these are the factors which we always look at, where my cost of handling, if I am able to reduce it, it makes it easier for me to do that. Also the product which I get, product mix which I can get, in terms of petrol or diesel, what I can get. These are factors which we always look at before we import. So ultimately the effort would be to make our landed cost in Sri Lanka the best possible under the circumstances.
So is it, this might be just an abrupt question, but is it wrong or is there justification in people sort of getting angry at the administration or the governments of various countries, whichever country you're in. Is it wrong to do that? Direct your anger at a government for the oil prices going up?
Public at large doesn't understand the mechanism of oil price. What the anger comes out of some frustration that I need to pay more. Whether the government is wrong or right, it becomes immaterial simply because the public doesn't understand. See, as long as I am as a customer, I am forced to pay more. Obviously, my anger has to be directed at somebody. The government is the easy target in that, and that is quite understandable. In fact, however much you try to make them understand, it doesn't work very easily simply because they have to pay more. But the reality is that the government is helpless on many occasions where there is no choice but to increase the prices. Otherwise, you can't afford to get the oil. That's what.
Can you find, before we go on to a different aspect of this, can you talk about the role of OPEC in all this?
They do have a very big role. They do determine the quantum of production and the prices. In fact, they do have their own logic for fixing a price at a particular level or fixing the production at a particular level. If they feel that the price has to be at a particular level, $90 or more, which they find it that today's economic pricing to be there, then the production gets restricted to that level. So they determine as who will produce how much and who will sell how much or what price they will sell, so that becomes economical for all of them to function. I mean, they have their own logic for doing that. I think there must be some merit in what they do. But we have to pay for the oil which we get.
Right. Changing direction a little bit, but staying on the topic, you spoke earlier about other factors coming into play when it comes to oil prices, such as Iran, which is prominent these days. Could you talk also about, did the Arab Spring have any